Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming along to attend this interview session with Will Page. The session is organised by the Society for Economic Research on Copyright Issues, that's SERCI. I am the General Secretary of SERCI. My name is Richard Watt. I'll be the host and interviewer today. Please be aware that the session is recorded. So anybody participating in the session will be captured. By participating in this session, it's assumed that consent is given for any capture that's made to be contained in that recording. And the recording will be made public so that anyone can see it, so yourselves and anybody else. So anyway, welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming, and welcome especially to our special guest today, Will Page. So Will is, of course, it's a great honour and it's a great privilege to be interviewing Will because, well, amongst other things, Will is one of these people who actually needs no introduction, although he's going to get one anyway, although short, because we don't want to spend too much time on that. Will is best known to us as a chief economist, first at PRS for music and then more recently at Spotify. As chief economist at Spotify, Will turned up perhaps 7 years ago, I'm honestly not sure, at a SERCI annual conference and has become a regular member. Will has come to, I think, every meeting that we've had since the first one where he was there, and he's participated with presentations every single year, very interesting material, and it's been very great for SERCI's members to keep in touch with the industry folk, as at the time Will was. So interesting, it's interesting to me as I read through Will's book right here, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit. Will brings up the story of a certain president, a US president, who wished for a one-handed economist on account of not wanting to get policy advised on the one hand something and on the other hand something else. And it seems to me at the moment that Will has turned himself into history's first three-handed economist, on account of, well, on the one hand, Will has produced a prolific amount of research for the business community. It's been influential research, and business and, well, the music business above all has greatly benefited from Will's work. On the other hand, Will has participated actively as an academic. He's been in our conference. He's done a lot of influential work that has been very well received. And I even noticed that Will is now a visiting scholar at LSE. So as an academic, there we have him as well, writing for academics. And then finally, on the other hand, so the third hand is Tarzan Economics, 8 Principles for Pivoting Through Disruption, Will's new book that he has written for everybody. I think anyone from high school kids through to pensioners, everything in between, every single person will get something out of this book. It's wonderfully entertaining, and I recommend it to everybody if you haven't already had a look at it. So I'm extremely grateful for Will for his time, making time for us in what must be a very hectic schedule. So thank you very much, Will. We're very appreciative and looking forward to hearing this interview with you.
And thank you, Richard, and thank you to everyone, Christian and the whole team involved in SERCI. I always stress it's unique. There are very few organizations out there that allow inquiring minds together and debate copyright. I'm very grateful for that.
Okay, so let me kick the session off, Will, with an observation. And that observation is, you are the epitome of a man who practices what he preaches, right? The book is entirely about how businesses, well, people in life, but businesses especially, instead of clutching the old vine, need to pass to a new vine in order to carry on their journey through the jungle. And well, you've seemed to have let go of the old vine of chief economist and grabbed the new vine of book writer. And so I'm really interested to know what were the catalysts and what was the motivation for the switch. Why was it that you were so intent on writing this book?
My passion has always been teaching economics. What gets me up in the morning. And today there's a twist to that, which is it's not typically teaching economics to students or to executives. What my father taught me was to teach economics to three types of people. People who A, don't think they're going to understand it. B, people who don't want to understand it. But more importantly, C, people who have to understand it. And that's the passion for me, is getting the message across without crossing over, getting economics to an audience who wouldn't typically come to Richard Watt's lectures. And the book allows you to do that at scale. So that was the real driver for that too, which was after a decade at Spotify and 6 years at the PRS, it was burning inside me for a long time, was to achieve that goal, which is to get economics across, not to the converted, but to the unconverted. The people in this call, they'll enjoy the book, but it's the people most removed from this call who I really want to get the book to.
That's interesting, and that leads me into the very next thing, to be honest. So your background obviously is heavily in music, and music resonates through the book and on every page. But the book is about disruption and how people approach disruption. Sorry. Okay. How people approach disruption.
That's cool.
Do you know what that is? Okay. Anyway, so there are plenty of other industries and people that are disrupted, like agriculture and climate change, like tourism and pandemics. So can everybody find something in this book?
Yeah, so just a quick,
and then realize it's
coming. Tech side, you may have some issues, but for other people in the call, you can put it on mute because it's coming through, especially Tune Registry as well. So yeah, the book is aimed at individuals, organizations and institutions that are staring at the same predicament music was facing at 20 years ago. And I think that's just rampant. I mean, for individuals questioning whether they should work for a firm or just go it alone and work for themselves. Well, Ronald Coase, The Theory of the Firm, 1937, told us a lot about that. The book will deal with that. For firms, you're asking what is the purpose of our product? You know, newspaper firms. Today I was with a very famous newspaper executive, and the first question is, why do you call them newspapers? And we had a new train station here in London called King's Cross. When it opened, it didn't have a newspaper stall. You know, it's just an example of what is the purpose of your business if the words will actually describe the business you're in. You're in the business of content behind a piece of glass on a smartphone. And then for governments, there's a whole chapter dedicated to what this means for government. But I think the key lesson there is what matters most to governments is often mean what's measured least. And the introduction of data science, I think government can change the game in terms of measuring other stuff than just gross domestic product. Quick example, would you want to measure the current recovery from the pandemic by tracking pollution levels? You could, perhaps you should, but would you want to do it that way? Or is there something else you can measure about the state that we're in as well? So, but for those three constituencies, I think there's a lot in the book that can be actually applied. So not just a good read, but actually you can put it to work. You can practice what it preaches.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's stick with music because it's what most of us in this call are interested in. So streaming of music, which was the response to this disruption, the disruption caused by digitization. Streaming of music is about music distribution. Music creation, on the other hand, really hasn't been disrupted as far as I can see. You still need lyricists, songwriters, musicians, instruments, and singers to create a piece of music. So I wonder if we think along the entire value chain of music, from creation through recording, through distribution to the consumer, have different parts of that value chain been affected differently by the new vine? Have there been winners and losers? If so, who?
Yeah, so your question reminds me of a famous Baumol paper called Cost Disease,
Yeah.
which very briefly he said, whatever the technology and the advancements you've seen in life, it still takes 4 people to perform in a quartet. You know, quartet can't be done with 3 because it's a quartet. And it's a nice reminder of what makes the art different from commerce, and why, again, SERCI is such an important, platform for trying to sort of tease out these issues as well. But yeah, the disruption has been, I think, felt across the value chain. At one end, people are now accessing 70 million songs on their phone, and every day 75,000 new songs are being ingested. Now, to put some sort of color around that figure, 75,000 new songs that were released today will not only be in competition with the 75,000 new songs released tomorrow, that's broadly the same amount of volume that the British Museum released back in 1984, 6,000 albums. So we're now releasing in one day what used to get released in 1984 in one calendar year. So that's the supply side dynamics on the content distribution side. On the creation side, there's a lot of interesting things happening. Yes, you still need producers. Yes, I would hope you still need arrangers. But if you look at the process of actually getting your content out there, and out there means on the World Wide Web, be it Jakarta, be it Sao Paulo, wherever, the company DistroKid is quite interesting because they're a DIY platform, so essentially artists who want to do it themselves. They don't have a 33-page contract that you need a lawyer to understand. They have 3 bullet points. You pay $20 fixed fee per year. You retain 100% of your copyright, and you see 100% of your money. That's it. It doesn't get any more complicated. And they're now responsible for 1/3 of all new music being released around the world. This is a company with 78 staff, which includes cleaners, is responsible for 1/3 of all music pouring into streaming platforms around the world right now. And that's interesting. And there's an economic angle to that, which is, why is DistroKid winning when so many other platforms that try to do this are losing? And a lot of the others that offer this DIY service, you disrupt the value chain, offered a commission model. So you didn't quite know how much you're going to pay the platform for getting your content there. DistroKid went down a fixed fee model and said just $20 and you're good to go. And the economists on this call, to which there are many, for every economist has 2 opinions, I think this is the difference between taking a bus and a taxi. So if you take a taxi, you introduce risk into the equation. You don't quite know how much that taxi journey is going to cost. You might hit traffic on the way out to Heathrow Airport. Who knows? There's risk. Whereas when you take a bus, you pay up front, and if you fell asleep on the bus, which I have done in Edinburgh a few times, drunk, but still, if you fall asleep, you don't have to pay a penny more. So it's quite interesting to apply SERCI style economics to that, which is what DistroKid did to disrupt the value chain, was offer a bus ticket, not a taxi ticket, to a business model. I think it's nuances like that which offer fresh scope for academics to explore.
Thanks for that. So the new Vine is streaming, and that's obvious. It's patently clear to anyone who looks at the numbers. But the old Vines still actually exist. There's still downloads. There's still a lot of radio play of music. We're getting a resurgence of vinyl. So to what extent is there promotional or substitutional effects between the different options available?
So I have a thesis in the book which looks at how customers like the thrill of a bargain. They also love the thrill of a luxury. They have no regard for what lies in between. So streaming is a bargain. It's been $9.99 in Britain since 2009. It's lost 1/3 of its value due to inflation. It's getting cheaper and there's more songs. So for the astute economists on this call, you can run a deflator through that, for example. More songs for less money. So it's a bargain, but it's the same consumer paying for that bargain £10 a month that's also paying £25 for a beautiful gatefold vinyl record, which they may not even open. And if they do, they may not even play. And by the way, I do think a lot of vinyl is being sold to people who don't have record players, but it's the same customer buying both. Now, a lot of my economics was trained to me by David Safier, and he looked at the aviation industry for me and said, you might have something here, because if you look at aviation, low-cost carriers who don't need the front of the plane to make money are doing great as we come out of the recovery. JetBlue is just getting 5-star reviews for £300 in New York from Gatwick Airport. High-end carriers, Emirates, Singapore Airlines are doing great, but British Airways, the world's 19th favorite airline, is stuck in the middle. You look at high street supermarkets. You've often taught me to look at how's food priced in the high street, understand economics. And you can see the high-end supermarkets are doing great. Waitrose here in the UK. The low end of winning market share, Aldi, but you wouldn't want to be Tesco. So I think what's interesting here is, if you remember Hotelling's lemma about how people converge towards the middle, I think what we're seeing is a reversal of that. The ice cream stalls in the middle of the beach, we're seeing ice cream stalls go out towards the edges. And that again is, when we get SERCI seminars back up and running, that again is something which needs to be threshed out, on stage and in the bars afterwards.
Totally agree. Now, you've brought up the issue of pricing. That was coming up on my list. So I'm gonna bring, dig a little deeper into this issue here.
Yeah.
You reminded me a few days ago about some discussion we had about the pricing of bananas, and I got thinking about that yesterday. And it just so happens that a subscription to Spotify, a premium subscription to Spotify, costs exactly the same as one banana per day here in New Zealand. Now, I'm not saying that you had anything to do with that, but it does make me wonder, how do you price? How did the first streaming service that came along, was it Rhapsody or Spotify?
Yeah.
How did they decide to price something that has infinite supply and zero marginal cost? So how do you work out a price for that?
So there is no complicated economic paper by Brett Danaher to cite here. It's very simple, unfortunately simple, you could say. Next year is 2022, if I've checked my calendar correctly, and that will be the 20-year anniversary of the $9.99 price point. Now remember, it's $9.99 US dollars, 9.99 euros, and it's 9.99 British sterling. And none of these currencies match. And for those who are interested, there's no VAT in America, so the license base is the whole 10. So even though it's cheap in America by British standards, the rights holder actually sees more, whereas in Britain, 20% of gross disappears to the tax man before you allocate. So the prices match, that's the key point. Three currencies, same price. And in 2002, Rhapsody asked for a license so they could offer catalog music as an access model to all their consumers. So 20 years ago, and I saw the memo from one label exec, which said, if it costs £10 a month to rent movies from Blockbuster, remember Blockbuster, it's going to cost £10 a month to rent music from Rhapsody. That's your price, and there's your license. And that's all I have to offer, I'm afraid. It doesn't get any more complicated. So again, a fairly simple story of match what videos cost, and that's your price. But we are now entering the 20th year anniversary of matching the cost of a Blockbuster rental card. Quite a bizarre story.
When did Blockbuster disappear?
2004.
Yeah, well,
no,
there you go.
yeah, 2004.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they disappeared because of late fees. They were addicted to late fees, and that's what they had. Digital IP more than anyone. They were innovators, but the fact was that business was addicted to late fees. Netflix saw that and they snapped it.
So that brings us to yet another paradox, I suppose, in my mind at least, right? So this price of 10, the number 10, has stuck 20 years, right? No adjustment for inflation, no adjustment for the humongous change in what you're getting, right? The quantity of choice that you get now is just night and day for where you were at the start. The $10 or £10 or 10 euros has stuck. So that's an old vine. Why hasn't the $15 vine been grabbed?
So there are arguments for and against this. And your argument has a bias. Your question is a bias, which is, why haven't you raised prices? There's a bias towards, why isn't it 15 or 20 now? As well. I want to offer a slightly different angle for the sake of balance here, which is to keep streaming growing. Clearly, the people who haven't paid yet are least interested in paying a recurring fee for music. So they're the ones you're going to get. Now, are you going to get to them by increasing your prices? I would argue no. So the first 100 million subscribers in America were very keen to pay for a service. The next 100 million are going to be less keen. So it's the balance of, how do you keep a subscription service moving forward? And I use the analogy in my book of tech is like a bicycle that doesn't move forward, it falls over. So far, we've not seen any music streaming service stall, fail to grow. That's a really important point. We've just seen YouTube, a business built off selling adverts, announce that 50 million people are paying them to not consume adverts. That's phenomenal. So how do you keep this bicycle moving forward? And I wonder whether raising prices raises an issue there of the people who have yet to pay are the ones who are least interested. There's some very simple self-selection asymmetric information in that to consider as well.
It is, well, it is, but as you said, there's a lot of economists on the call, and we're taught to maximize profits, right? The price according to profit maximum. You seem to be talking in terms of pricing according to maximizing subscribers or maximizing sales of some description. How, why is it true? I understand that Spotify is yet to make a profit on the, and so
they're a public company and they've yet to really produce positive cash flow. So
that's what I mean. So is it time for a change? I mean, are there enough subscribers that now the services could exploit them better? There's an elasticity question to consider, really.
There is, and I don't want to get into the particulars of licensing models, but it's no secret that all streaming services have a revenue share model. So if you're not cash flow positive and you're this size and you 2x the size of your company, then with the revenue share model, you're still not going to be cash flow positive, assuming all other things are held equal. So there is that to consider. But also there's the growth side to consider. I mean, one example I often use is Mexico. And if I said to you that Spotify launched in Mexico in 2013, heavily involved in that, and it hasn't raised prices since, you'd think Latin America, inflation, you must be crazy. If I also said to you that the Mexican music industry keeps on growing at accelerating rates, bigger numbers at a faster rate, you'd say that's crazy. The point is the two things are linked. And I'd also encourage this call, and there's some very, very clever people in this call, to also go a little bit further. I'll stay with Latin America for this example. I've heard many people say there's a problem with family plan in Latin America. There's too many people on the plan, the family plan is too popular. Well, you have to apply some Tarzan economics and attack it from another angle. Perhaps the family plan is telling you what the market clearing price was. That's a signal that you can use. Perhaps it's an issue of financial inclusion and gender in Latin America, where males may have credit cards, but females feel excluded. Well, how are they supposed to pay if they don't have a card? They are dependent on the family plan. So you have to bring in a role of culture. So there are some basic economic tools you'd use of, wait a second, inflation, price, elasticity. But I just ask you to go a little bit further in your understanding of the pros and cons of the status quo before you move away from that.
It's very interesting. One of the go-to possibilities that an economist would immediately latch upon for the constant price or the same price across services, for example, is something to do with, mega competition in this market. So we know that Spotify is not the only service. They all compete, I suppose, ferociously. How competitive is this world? How does a startup streaming service get a piece of the action here?
It's very easy for them to get a piece of one side of the market's action. To get the licenses is relatively straightforward, and there's all sorts of new services entering which claim to carry all the world's repertoire. So that's on the content side. To get the consumer side is where the challenge is. How do you achieve scale? I do think we do a disservice to many other streaming services by almost like vacuum cleaner and Hoover streaming equals Spotify. I mean, just to reiterate, YouTube, 50 million subscribers, and that's account holders. Family plan members, that could be well over 100 million, and we don't discuss them enough and what they're doing. And KK Box in Southeast Asia, phenomenal service, doesn't get a mention. So we should recognize how heterogeneous the streaming service market really is. And then the second point in terms of competition is just very quickly, it's a zero-sum game in music. So if Richard Watts spends $9.99 on Apple Music, he needn't spend a penny more on any other service. Now, if you look at video streaming, if I subscribe to Netflix, then there's a very good chance I'm also going to subscribe to Disney Plus and vice versa. So if we were Netflix and Disney Plus executives debating here, it's like we compete for consumption. I hope that my premiere is going to be more popular than your premiere on your platform. But we don't. We actually collaborate or complement in terms of subscription. If you can get that subscriber to jump in and pay you a fee, you're helping my cause get that subscriber pay a fee to me. So I think it's very important to differentiate music from video streaming and understand how a zero-sum game for music, we say $9.99, just like we said in 2002, is all I want and not a penny more. Whereas in video streaming, everybody's paying for more services. It's complementary. And just to really put the boot in here, video streaming services are raising prices. There's a fascinating distinction between the two.
It is. It is. Okay, so let's have we talk about. So the fact of the matter is, streaming is easy. Basically, it's easy to do. It's easy to gather data. The service learns a lot about the consumer. The service knows a lot about which songs are played, therefore where the license fees are due to be paid. It seems that there's a lot of reduction in transactions costs going on, but there's also an increase in fragmentation of rights. You've said yourself, right? You don't need necessarily a major label anymore. You can just go it alone. So at the same time as a reduction in transactions cost, there seems to be a huge increase in the number of rights holders to deal with. So in that kind of a setup, what is the future, or is there a future for collective management of copyright in music?
The more fragmented the market becomes, the more you need collective solutions. We saw this in the River Rhine, something I documented in my book way back in the 1400s. People building castles in the banks of the Rhine to charge tolls for people who wish to use it. Well, why not just have one big toll at the top of the Rhine and divvy up the proceeds to the castle barons backstage? That's a collective license back then. That's what you see collective licensing do today. And I can give you some numbers to kind of really sort of flesh this one out. Back in the 80s and the 90s, there was pretty much, if you were a retail store, you would have 18 parties to work with. 7 major labels, a bunch of indies, and a few aggregators. So less than 20, okay, less than 20. Today, if you're a streaming platform, you'll be working with about 780, 790 distributors to get your content. And as more you expand into emerging markets, the more new distributors you're going to have to work with as well, especially if you start into continents like Africa. So you have way more. And we could dwell on the pros and cons of collective licensing, but I would like to just cite one example, which was said on stage at a CSAC Broadcasting Licensing Committee. So it was a public stage, so I can say this, and it was the head of licensing for the BBC. And he said, as it currently stands, I have to have 2 lunches. One with the PRS, we argue, I want to pay less, they want me to pay more, and we settle and they walk away with 50 million quid. And one with PPL, which is the artists and the record labels. And I want to pay them less, they want me to pay me more, we argue, and I pay them 40 million quid. And then he said this, I would happily pay you both more money if I only have to have one lunch. The cost of the copyright, which is what all the lawyers get pedantic about, is one thing. The value of convenience that the blanket license begins is a whole different thing. And it is not stretching the imagination to argue the value of convenience can often be worth more than the copyright. And that's the beauty of the blanket license.
Yes, I agree.
Sell convenience and you'll find a whole lot more than if you sell complexity.
So just before we start wrapping up, because I'm a bit conscious of time and I'm not going to impose too much upon you, I do have, as a an older music consumer, I have a query for you. Has streaming and the way that streaming works, has it changed the landscape? Are there going to be albums anymore, or is the whole thing singles dominated now?
Yeah, people get a little bit worried about where streaming is taking us. And I think there's grounds to be worried, but there's also grounds to realize that we've been there before. And I'll give you 2 very quick examples. In the chapter of the book called Paying Attention, which in itself is an interesting title. In the English language, which we're speaking here today, we say pay attention. If you look at other languages, the French, Spanish, Swedish, it's offer, share, or give attention. They don't use the currency of paying. But I talk about what's happened to songwriting, where songs have got shorter and choruses are getting shoved to the front. Makes total sense. if you only get paid after being played for 30 uninterrupted seconds, you should put the chorus right up the front to hook you in. I don't want you skipping or turning out. And if you don't get paid a penny more for lasting a second more, well, why write longer songs? Any rational economist would write shorter songs with the chorus to the front if that's a model. Now, you might say, where is this taking us? What's happening to albums? Just remember that in the 1950s and the 60s, when the mafia ran jukeboxes across America, they demanded that the singles in that jukebox lasted 2 minutes, 30 seconds, hence Motown. Why? To extract the most value from the jukebox. So yeah, we've been there before, we'll be there again. It's like the tail that wags the dog. There's no show without business, there's no business without show. And I think what we're learning now is how the business of the streaming is affecting the show.
So with that in mind, if you came across an 18-year-old high school graduate who loves music and wants to make it big, what advice would you give that person?
Learn how to code and get into software development. No, I would say, I think the first thing is, and it's tackled in the book Make or Buy, which is a universal question we ask whatever our career is. When do you go it alone and when do you seek and fault an intermediary? I think that question needs to be reframed. If I use an American football analogy of how many yards upfield can you make it before you need help? And I'm not saying you can get all the way to the end zone by going it alone, but you can just get a whole lot further upfield, which gives you a whole lot more leverage, a whole lot more negotiating power before you need to call in the roles of intermediaries. I think that's the interesting thing to consider there as well, which is, should you, that 18-year-old, sign away your intellectual property to a record deal for a huge advance? Maybe, if the advance is big enough, it may make sense. But just be aware of all the creator tools that are now coming on board, things such as Patreon and Kickstarter, live streaming, Sound Better, which is like a LinkedIn for finding artists, like Fiverr for the music industry. I need to find an arranger. You can find that now. I think those types of features shouldn't be overlooked. So I just would hope that 18-year-olds are well aware of just how far you can make before you need to buy.
Excellent. Okay, well, Will, you've been the chief economist of two major music-related organizations. You're a wonderfully successful, I hope, book writer. Certainly it's an entertaining product. What's next? What do you think you're going to do next? Where's the next vine that's swinging close by?
What am I going to do next? Probably learn Spanish at last. But what's next? I think the main thing I focus on is attention. I argue in the book it's the first fork in the road you have to deal with before you do anything else, and to look at where attention is going. And we look at the way that gaming is soaking up attention now. Well, if they're winning attention, that means someone else is losing. If Netflix wins attention because we're watching some crazy documentary drama about tigers in captivity, well, they're winning, which means music loses, means Snapchat loses, means Facebook loses. So try and understand who the friends and foes are in a battle of attention is where to work out we're going next. I think there's going to be a big drive towards making attention more efficient. And one startup that's really interesting me is called Uptime. The name of the company is Uptime as opposed to Downtime, so uptime.app. And they're turning books into 5-minute segments. Now, we've seen Get Abstract make books 30-minute reads. We've seen Blinkist turn books into 50-minute summaries. We're now seeing Uptime take it down to 5 minutes. And they've done my book in 5 minutes. They've done a fantastic job. I think, in terms of where next, don't follow the dollar, follow the attention dollar. Like, who can make attention more efficient is going to extract a whole lot of value. Now, that's what I believe.
Very good. Well, we certainly wish you all the best with whatever that project may turn out to be, and we certainly wish you all the best with this current book. So that's basically where I'm going to leave this, so that we've got the time for Q&A. Somebody has put in the chat about the recording. I did mention before, the recording will become public for everybody, so don't worry about that. Now, in terms of Q&A, what I'm going to try and do here is turn it over to the general public. What I need people to do, though, is to use the little hand raise feature here in Zoom, and wait until I call your name. If I'm able to, I've lost my mouse again. Anyway, I'm going to try to see whose hands get raised. and call you by name. When I call you by name, you can ask your question and then mute yourself again so that Will can speak. Please keep the questions short so that we can get as many of these in as possible. And well, here we go. Let's open the floor.
And as we do that, you just made me think, as you talked about my career, you said Spotify and POS for music, and you talked about cash flow negative. So part of my career was working for a company that's still cash flow negative, and the other part was working for a not-for-profit collecting society. So maybe what's next is work for a profitable company.
Finally. Christian,
I still don't know what that looks like.
you're first up with the hand raised.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to turn the camera on for as long as I speak, just to be polite, right? But you can see me too. Thanks, Will. Lovely interview. Great book. Just for proof of concept, I've got it here. Certainly held my attention longer than Piketty or Mazzucato or other greats that made it into, recommended lists and so on over the recent years.
German translation next month, sir. German translation next month. So.
Not required on my end, but fair enough. Your book is a wonderfully skilled example of how to present economic reasoning in an accessible and entertaining manner, right? I'm always rubbing shoulders with people who emphasize the rhetorics of economics and so on. You mentioned your father as a role model in terms of communicating economics and teaching it. What other recommendations can you give us for good sources on how to work on our style and on our, storytelling, so to speak?
So I think there's two. One, I do a very bad job pronouncing his name, and the other is easy. So when I started on the book, I realized very quickly that I couldn't write. Sounds strange, and my mentor, David Safir, reminded me many times of my grammatical skills, but I just couldn't write. I mean, I can write reports for Daniel Ek, and I can write investor decks for potential investors in Spotify, but writing a book, and I stumbled on a book that was recommended to me by a Yale professor, no longer with us, but William Zinsser, and the book is called On Writing Well. And I have to get on my hands and knees here and preach to everybody in the audience. That book made my book possible. And what he teaches me, and what he would teach any academic, economist, statistician, regardless, is how to get clutter out of your language, how to look at a paragraph and turn that thing into a sentence. The William Zinsser On Writing Well was pretty much the most powerful book I've read in my life. That was huge. Another thing on presentation skill real quick is Barbara Minto, much easier surname to say, and her pyramid principle of writing, which is most people start with background, context, survey data, conclusion, annex. Beyond the scope of this paper are the following issues, just to really disturb your line of reasoning. He scraps all of that. Begin with a problem statement, give your solution, then offer some background, and finish up with some context. It'd be quite hard for an academic who's been doing this for years or decades to swap that around, but if you want to satisfy yourself, stick with your current way of writing. If you actually want to preach to the unconverted, so not just have a few friends in academia read your paper, but get to that audience which doesn't read academic papers, you need to change that style. Start with the problem, then go to the solution, then give me some background, and finally wrap up with a touch of context. That's all I need to engage. And that's tough. That is tough for people who are used to doing the way things have been done. But I think your compliments to the book are an example of using that style seems to have resonated. So hopefully that can help.
Thanks, Will. Raphael, lovely to see you back with us on the call. Have you got a question?
I do. Thank you, Richard, and lovely to be back. Greetings from Ottawa. I guess I was interested, following up a little bit on what you were asking about pricing. So one of the there are two types of products that you can buy from a streaming service, like Spotify, but there are others, of course. A streaming service can sell you the right to play the tracks you want at the time you want them. I want to hear this track right now. I want to hear that track right now. Or a streaming service can sell you the right to hear some sort of a curated set of tracks. Somebody who's really smart, knows a lot about music, puts together a playlist for you and you can hear their playlist. What's always been remarkable to me is that these two services are both bundled as a single price and also priced at the same amount. It would seem to me that if you think about the classic theory of price discrimination, there might be some difference in the sort of person who wants to hear a playlist which some musically intelligent person has put together, or somebody who simply wants to listen to music which they themselves select. Why, in your view, will have streaming services not tried to exploit this sort of issue in their pricing?
So there's some technical jargon here, which is in the industry we refer to source of streams. And there are many sources in the technical world. You can group them into searching, discovering, and owning. So there's actually 3 ways to consider streaming. And I guess where your question is coming from is at one end, you've got streaming, which is kind of like radio. And then the other end, you've got streaming, which is kind of like ownership downloads. Why not price a radio model, which you can see with Pandora One, $5 a month at one price, and price the others at a more higher price, which is the $10 we're used to. I think option value helps explain why that hasn't happened, which is you can't determine what the consumer wants. When Spotify launched Discover Weekly in 2015, in the summer of 2015, heavily involved in that with Matthew Ogle, the inventor of Discover Weekly. And this is documented in the book. We didn't know that was going to be a success. We had no knowledge it was going to take off the way it did. The consumer did. So what you've got now is a situation where the consumer's empowered. So that might make an academic think, right, clearly it's all about algorithmic streams. Then along comes a human curated playlist like Rap Caviar, which is human curated stream. Should that be treated the same as Discover Weekly? But I think at the heart of it is option value and just the realization that it's the customer, the consumer that's in control. So you don't quite know what they find valuable. You might think sleep music's got no value at all. Well, for somebody who lacks sleep, if that can help them get 8 hours sleep, that's incredibly valuable. Who are you to say to the customer, clearly this is laid back, music pushed to you, when a customer could have a different value proposition. Ultimately, though, you're hoping that music has and always will be voluntary to pay. And this array of services, this option value that's inside that bundle price will make people pay for something where it's voluntary to pay.
Thank you, Raphael, and thank you, Will. Next up is Othman.
Hi, thank you for your time. It's really interesting. Actually, I'm doing a thesis on pricing in recorded music. So I have several questions, but I limit to one first. We all know that Spotify streaming platforms like Spotify are increasingly important in distribution of music. And on that platform, since there is a lot of different music and always more, recommendation algorithms are really important for the consumers to navigate through the sea of contents. The recommendation algorithm and helps Spotify to have like an increasing control on the music that are actually listened to and the beloved charts for music industry. Actually, I think we can see that Spotify is pushing more and more these algorithmic playlists like Daily Mix and the one for the besties and stuff like that. But don't you think that systems like Discovery Mode, where the artists accept to have a less royalties to be featured on the algorithmic recommendation like autoplay and radios, and the marquee, where I think artists are paying to have a small pop-up on the Spotify application to be featured for also. It can be seen like as a floating fee or maybe as a payola, which is making a comeback.
Okay, so you asked quite a few questions there. You said you had others. And I'll stress to everybody in the room, please direct questions that we can't answer to Richard, and I will make the best effort to answer them, and we'll include that in the public presentation. So I want to leave no questions behind of the remaining minutes that we have. Let me zero in on the payola question. One of the best things about what Richard Watt has done with SERCI is to gather this ramshackle group of eccentric minds together for conferences 1 or 2 years. You learn stuff you would never learn otherwise. And I asked Judge David Strickler, who sits on the Copyright Royalty Board in America, about discovery mode. And not necessarily about discovery mode, but about what Pandora did with Merlin, where Merlin said, we want to increase our market share of streams. And Pandora said, well, you can have more share if you accept a lower rate. So there was steering for cash arrangement there. Uncomfortable with that, but think about it. Merlin wanted to win market share against the majors. And they said to Pandora, I'll take less cash if you increase my clock. And of course, Pandora's mainly push streams. They're in control of what you're listening to. They had better monopolistic screening power, if you think about the Joseph Stiglitz 1976 paper, to dictate that clock in the favor of Merlin. Now, very quickly to sum up your question, I asked Judge Strickler, isn't that payola? And he said, and this was at the airport lounge at Montpellier in a heat wave in France, which I think is where you're from, where it's 44 degrees. For a Scotsman, that's just unbearable. We have 2 seasons, winter and June. And I said to him in the airport, isn't that payola? And he said, no, because you're accepting a reduction in payment. Legally, payola is when you take an increase in payment. So if I gave you more money to get my song played on radio, that's payola. If I accept less money to get my song played on radio, that's not payola. Now you may say, bouge de là, the law is an ass. I don't believe any of this, but the judge told me that, and I'm not going to question the judge.
Wise words, not to question the judge. So, Alan, you're next up. Thomas?
Come off mute, maybe.
How are you? Well, you have to unmute. I can't.
I don't know. Why can we never remember to do this?
There he is.
Yes, well, thank you for a fantastic talk, Will, and very excellent questions by Richard. My question is, though, the film industry, as I understand it, has generally managed pretty well without collective management. And collective management seems to be a response to massive, massive transactions costs. Now, I think some things are happening about the way in which royalties are paid under streaming, but I don't know much about it. Could we ever see a day when an artist gets remunerated on the basis of the consumption of his work and only his work? Because that seems like the goal for a really efficient market in creative works.
So that could simply be, hey, artists, set up your own streaming service. Or take it to the next level, hey, record label, set up your own streaming service. Although I remind people in the book that the record labels tried to set up their own streaming services twice, Press Play and Sony Connect, and they were both voted universally the 7th and 9th worst websites in the history of the internet. They weren't very good at that. So there's a division of labor. Do what you're good at, developing artists, streaming services do what they do good at, developing a customer proposition. So there's all sorts of economics there. But you're also touching on a huge debate, which we published, myself and David Steffier, 2 papers on through SERCI on the website, which is the distribution model. So not just this artist makes this money, but how about we ask the consumer? You ring fence my £10, €10, $10 subscription to just my music, and you don't pool it into a pot and allocate it pro rata share. Basically, whoever gets 1% of all the streams in that period in that market gets 1% of all the cash. And that's a live debate. And I think you're going to see over the next 2 to 3 years that model begin to get crystallized. Alison Wenham in 2007 stood up at a CZAC conference and said, collective licensing is either capitalism with a touch of communism or communism with a touch of capitalism. And I think she got booed off stage, but I actually stood up and applauded her because it's such a profound remark about the tension in collective licensing. Streaming is now 20 years into communism. And as Ronald Reagan says, tear this wall down. I think you're going to have to bring some capitalism to communism to reward. Not all streams are worth the same. That's the point that we're going to be dealing with for the next 5 years.
If I could just chip in quickly in response, because the original music efforts, Press Play and so forth, were hugely hampered by American competition law, by antitrust. And I wonder whether, in fact, at the end of this arc, the answer might be antitrust that drives people towards an actually per consumption, per payment solutions.
I can't comment to that, but I do think antitrust is a huge problem. And I simply cite people who read The Economist, hopefully everyone here, to the letter that I wrote and got published a month ago, which created all sorts of storm. I got a very nasty email from the SEC for that letter, but I simply said, you know, we need to learn from screaming Lord Sutch of the monster raving loony party when he famously argued for 2 competition authorities. I just love that observation. How can you give the monopoly the job to uphold competition? It just doesn't make sense. You need competition and upholding competition. And I furthered the argument by saying, if you borrowed £9,000 to study at LSE this year, there would be a lecture which says a monopoly reduces output and increases costs. What tech monopolies are doing today is expanding output and reducing costs. Those textbooks are not fit for purpose. Do not pass go, do not collect £200. That's a huge problem when you try to apply antitrust to this world of, you know, collective solutions. People want the option value, but I can't because antitrust won't let me. Well, who are you serving? We need 2 competition authorities.
Thank you.
Okay, so Christian, you
Great
have your
question.
hand up again. If there's nobody else, I'm going to let you have 2 bites at this cake here. So you go for it. There's nobody else at the moment.
2 bites at the
Well,
hand.
thanks, Richard. Completely different question, but it leads on, or it continues well, I think, connects well to the previous question regarding competition. Now, I was fascinated by your book on the treatment on big data, right, and how it improves governance on all kinds of levels. We are a society for, you know, economic analysis regarding copyright issues. So what about intellectual property, sui generis rights, something that for an economist looks pretty much like copyright regarding databases and so on. So I would love to hear your take on the question whether we can accept that this data, which emanates from lots of people as initially a side effect, but now maybe a core business part for these platforms, and that these platforms act as gatekeepers to provide access to this data for also public institutions to some extent. How do you see that? How can we use that data for the benefit of all of society when we actually have very strong gatekeepers holding on to it?
Yeah, this is a very, very important question to work through. I think the first point is there is clear to me, as somebody who's got a foot in both camps, that academics and organizations, companies, for-profit private companies are lost in translation. Even at the PRS, people saying, hey, can I get all your songwriter data? Because I want to do this PhD thesis on songwriter earnings. No, you are not going to get the private bank account information of 68,000 British songwriters. That's not how it works. I would love, and post-lockdown, when SERCI can get back up and running and start having seminars, I think there's a need to have a proper dialogue about how should academics approach companies for data, and how should companies engage with academics to make use of that data, because there's faults on both sides. The questions that are coming in are cumbersome, time-consuming, and this company's got to make a profit, this academic gets paid regardless. It's just a disconnect, and I don't like seeing people lost in translation. We need to improve that. And secondly, there may be a public good in sharing that data, but is that going to help the share price and the modus of the company, given they've got cutthroat competition that the academic doesn't have? So just a reality check about the circumstances of how these people are working. I publish papers this year, I'll publish papers next year, whereas on the other side of the fence, my company might go bankrupt because the other company got a foot up because of a leak of some data of some sort. So just a reality check of the different settings. There's a third thing that I want to touch on, and for keen observers of collective rights management, you know, I think Ruth Powers is on this call, she will appreciate this, which was the chief executive of the Performing Rights Society gave a seminar once to Billboard magazine, and I was watching it on a live stream. She said, I want to turn PRS, which let's remind ourselves, as with any collective society, GAMA, you know, SATM, is a not-for-profit membership governed collective management organization. I want to turn this data, PRS, this collecting study, into a data machine. Classic leadership speak of data, data, data. I'm going to turn it into data, the values in the data. And the moderator took a 2-minute pregnant pause and said, but is it your data? And it just went silent because it is a membership governed not-for-profit organization. I was just We can argue whether it is or not. It's an assignment of the copyright to the collective management organization. For lawyers in the call, the word assignment is very important. But it's just, I was staggered that there wasn't a prepared response to that question, which is your membership governed. Who are you to say you want to monetize the data of your members? And that's just a very interesting tension within the collecting studies about data, which is whose data is it?
Okay, well, thanks, Will. That's an insightful comment, actually, and you're right that we need a lot of work on that. Sounds like a special issue of the journal to me, of SERCI. Anyway, I think we've run out of hands up, and we're probably pretty much getting close to running out of time, and I'm sure you've got other things to do. So many thanks to all the participants, and above all, of course, many thanks to Will. It's been a huge pleasure. It's been a privilege to chat with you, to get your thoughts on all these interesting topics. Wish you all the very best with the book, and wish you all the very best with your next projects, and really do look forward to catching up again at some point.
You have to tell us, when is SERCI going to gather again?
Ask the politicians when they stop closing us down. And I've had a vaccine jab, so maybe sooner. Don't know. Anyway,
I hope everybody on the call and all their friends and family are in good health.
All right. Okay.
Next year.
Well, look, thanks for everything, Will. You've been a real soldier. Thanks, and I know your time is valuable, and you're very generous to offer it to us.
No worries. I really appreciate it, and I really look forward to SERCI regathering again.
Excellent. We'll stay in touch. So,
Take
bye,
care.
everybody. Look out for the video when it goes up. I'm ending. Bye.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Richard. Bye-bye. Cheers.
Bye.